the next meeting of the Catholic Bedside, you'll note that it is at Our Lady of Mercy Parish in Aurora. That actually happens to be my home parish. So if you don't show up, I will find out. And you see all the tables and all this? My dad is actually what he likes to refer to as the maintenance manager. Or, I'm sorry, the supreme maintenance supervisor. So when you sit down, when you go there next month and you sit down, the chair you sat in, thank my dad. But so, you know, I don't often use this mic. I don't know how loud I should be in it. But yes, my talk is entitled Fathers Know Best. Or The Fathers Know Best, to be precise. And I want to start off by telling a story. And you should remember the story, because if you do indeed show up next month, you will no doubt probably find my dad, and this story does include him. So what happened? Oh, you know, this is just weird. I'll just be loud. So it happened one day that my family was going on vacation. And in the lead car was my mom, my dad, and my youngest brother. And following some distance behind, because my other brother had forgotten something, was myself and my middle brother. And we were probably about 15 minutes behind my parents. And as we're driving along, we get a phone call. It's Mom. And first she asked an innocent question, "Where are you?" And so I say, "Well, it looks like we're coming up on exit so-and-so." And she tells me, "Oh, good. Get off at the exit, go to the gas station, and pick up your brother." So yes, I got off at the exit, went to the gas station, and there was my little brother Philip waiting there patiently at the convenience stop right there. Yes, my parents had forgotten him completely. They had stopped for gas, they got out, they bought some snacks, they got back in, and they drove for they told me later, about 10 minutes before asking themselves, "Do you hear Philip? Philip, are you there?" So what do we learn from this little anecdote? Well, it's really quite simple. Let's basically think of my little brother Philip as God. I wouldn't say this normally, of course. But think of Philip as God. For God, too, is awfully quiet. Usually. And so is my little brother. Usually. And it's easy to put God out of mind. To simply assume that God is there, simply presume upon God. And this is a very great danger for us as Christian men, that we essentially forget God in our lives. It is a fact that we have to take conscious action to remember to place God foremost in our lives. We have to take concrete steps to keep God in our lives. And we have to do so on a regular basis. Once a week, on a Sunday, just isn't enough. It's good, of course. I encourage all of you to come to Mass on Sunday. In fact, I'll put it beyond encouragement and say you really ought to be here. Well, actually, yes, you really ought to be here at St. Mary in Park Forest. But if you wish, you may go to your own parishes. They're not as good, but since you're all Catholics, you will find the Mass and the Holy Eucharist there. So, what are we to do next? let's talk about the danger of simply presuming God is there. You know, Pope Benedict actually put out a letter not too long ago, really just last month, maybe the month before. And in this letter, Pope Benedict quoted the theologian Hans Ur von Balthasar, which I got to admit is the most awesome name ever. I mean, Hans Ur von Balthasar. I mean, yeah, sort of like, wow. But in this letter, Pope Benedict quoted von Balthasar. And the quote is this: "Do not presuppose the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but present them." Now, when I was in the seminary, when I first got to Mundelein Seminary and started studying theology, one of the very first things that they told us, was that you have to study theology second. First, you must have faith in God. First comes faith, then comes the study. It's much the same here. We have to present God rather than simply just assuming God is there. Because I can tell you what happens when, as a theologian, you simply presume God is there, but you don't actually put God first. You don't have faith in God. You start getting led off in weird directions. Your studies start taking you to studies for weird, I was about to say obscene knowledge, but that's not probably that. Abstract quest for obscure, or what did I put there? Arcane knowledge. Instead of a mission to help mankind know God. Here, Father John Horan, let me throw out a name to you. Schillerbeck. That should be a scary name to anybody who studies theology. A German theologian who went way off the rails. Who you basically can say, simply presumed God was there and forgot entirely about presenting God. Had no faith in God. We are meant to present God to the world. We can't simply say, oh, God's there, and then kind of shove God aside. We have to present God. Keep God in the foremost thoughts that we have. On day-to-day and hour-to-hour basis. Now, I will tell you that the necessity of presenting God is not simply limited to myself as a priest or to a deacon. It is really a mission that is given to every single Christian. It really is a mission that is given to every single one of you. You are meant to present God, not only for yourselves, but for your families, for your co-workers, for your neighbors, for your communities. Every Christian, whatsoever their occupation or their vocation, is life to meant... Oh boy, that was really messed up. Every Christian... Oh, that's it. Every Christian in life is meant to present God to the world. It makes sense if I read it right. It's meant to present God to the world. And by world, I mean that world in the greatest, broadest sense. The home, the workplace, the store, the bar. Let's not forget the bar. I mean, let's face it. There's probably a lot of men who have forgotten God in the bar and let themselves into trouble. We are meant to present God. Notice also, though I mean to present God in the bar, that's not necessarily meaning jump up on a bar stool and start shouting, "Convert now." It does mean to act as a Christian man wherever you are. Our society needs men to present God to the world. And this is not a task that can be simply delegated off. You can't simply expect me or Father Moran or Father Benedict or Deacon Ed to do it for you. Goodness gracious, there's only a handful of us. Goodness gracious. This is a job, a mission that God gave you in baptism, in confirmation, in marriage. You might say that you are all meant to be ambassadors of God. You are all meant to present, just as an ambassador kind of presents themselves for their home nation to another. You are meant to present God to another nation, another people who, quite frankly, may not know God that well. Now, I want to ask you, what do you think happens when we forget to present God to others? When we simply presume God is there and do nothing? Oh, dear me. Now, again, I'm going to turn to Pope Benedict. And since the lettering is kind of small and you probably can't see it back there, I will call it out. It's a kind of a longish quote. A society without God, a society that does not know Him and treats Him as non-existent, is a society that loses its measure. In our day, the catchphrase of God's death was coined. When God does die in a society, it becomes free, we were assured. In reality, the death of God in a society also means the end of freedom, because what dies is the purpose that provides orientation, and because the compass disappears that points us in the right direction by teaching us to distinguish good from evil. Western society is a society in which God is absent in the public sphere. It has nothing left to offer it. And that is why it is a society in which the measure of humanity is increasingly lost. At individual points, it becomes suddenly apparent that what is evil and destroys man has become a matter of course. I suspect that each and every one of you could provide some example that would back up what Pope Benedict has written. Some example of some bit of chaos that you have observed, that you have seen, or perhaps experienced, that results from placing God aside, from placing the morality we receive from God aside. This is the great danger that comes from forgetting to place God in our lives as a true present. As Catholics, we know that God is at the center of everything. If we neglect the center of our lives, our society, our civilization, how long will these things endure? And what will they look like before they crumble? You ever get the feeling that things are crumbling? I suspect you all will probably say, yes, I see it. Now, I will grant you that probably every single generation has thought things are going down the tubes. But I got to think that they really are this time. So if we recognize and agree that there is a great problem, if we recognize and agree that our society in general has simply presumed God is there but has forgotten to put Him forefront, to make Him present, what are we to do to make God present again in our society? Oh, let's jump to part 4. Now, what will this mean? Well, I can kind of give you some, call it background, to what society kind of generally thinks because it has forgotten to put God in its life. We often hear that essentially God tells us everything is just wonderful. Just keep on doing what you're doing. God loves you. God indeed loves you. But you'll recall from the Gospels that Jesus is constantly telling people to repent. You'll recall that God calls us to change our lives. And yet we often hear, just keep doing what you're doing. Nor has God revealed himself to mankind to take us all to heaven without regard to how we live our lives here on earth. Sometimes, let's face it, we live in a society where basically it's everything goes. Every action, every sin. Of course, the definition of sin has been radically transformed to basically mean nothing at all. But let me tell you what is truly meant. God has revealed himself so that we might have conversion of heart to be more like God, so that we might be worthy of the promises of Christ. In other words, so that we might be better than we could ever be if we simply relied on our own merits, our own abilities, our own efforts. This is a difficulty, because these first two things, keep doing what you're doing, there's nothing wrong with what you're doing, that leads to, spiritual moral flabbiness. I've got the physical flabbiness down, but do I wish to be morally flabby, spiritually flabby? No! There ought to be a challenge in our lives. Let's face it, I think every man wants there to be a challenge in his life. Here is a challenge for you. To live a life that presents God to others. And yes, first of all, it's going to mean living a moral life yourselves. A life in accordance with the teachings of Christ, the teaching of his church. That is one way to present God to the world, by the example of your own lives. Some of you, I suspect, perhaps most of you, have heard of this Exodus 90. Can I see a raise of hands? How many people have heard this Exodus 90? Oh, how many people? Okay, let's go on this. How many people are doing the Exodus 90 or have done? Just did it. Would you agree that it is a challenge?
Yeah.
Do you believe it's a worthwhile challenge?
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah, especially dropping the TV and stuff like that.
All of us are looking for challenges. We could say, of course, I simply want to sit in front of the TV all day long and do nothing. And after the first 3 or 4 weeks, I'm sure that of doing that perhaps you'll think that's wonderful. But then week 5 hits and you say, but really, is this what I'm called to do with my life? We're looking for a challenge. Here is a challenge for you. Present God to the world by the example of your lives, by how you speak to others, by how other people see you doing things. Now, how to present God? Oh my goodness, I only got 3 minutes? How to present God? 2 ways. Be conscious of God at all times. Don't create a separate box in your life for God. Don't leave God simply to Sunday morning or Saturday evening. And 2, be brave. Keep God in the center of your life. As Pope John Paul II said, do not be afraid. Because, of course, putting God first in your life, presenting God to the world, is a difficult challenge. Not simply in terms of having to climb a 50-foot wall or something. It is a spiritual challenge to go against the course of the world. Let me give to you a test case on this. The picture you see here is of the USS Wasp, a United States aircraft carrier in the Second World War. One of the officers on board was a Catholic, Lieutenant Commander John Joseph Shea. Just before the Wasp left its port on the west coast, leaving for the South Pacific and for war, Commander Shea wrote home to his 5-year-old son. I'm only going to quote parts of this. When you are a little bit bigger, You will know why your daddy is not home so much anymore. You know we have a big country, we have ideals as to how people should live and enjoy the riches of it, and how each is born with equal rights to life, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness. Unfortunately, there are some countries in the world where they don't have these ideals, where a boy cannot grow up to be what he wants to be, with no limits on his opportunities, to be a great man, such as a great priest, statesman, doctor, soldier, businessman, etc. Here I want to point out something to you. How Commander Shea lists being a great priest among his vocations. We have to encourage vocations to the priesthood, to the religious life. Encourage men to take up the challenge of ministering to others in God's church. At the same time, notice how Commander Shea lists all these other vocations you have and are living as opportunities to live this Christian life. In other words, to live in a way that presents God to others. Let me go on. In the meantime, take care of mother. Be a good boy and grow up to be a good young man. Study hard when you go to school. Be a leader in everything good in life. Be a good Catholic. And you can't help being a good American. Play fair always. Strive to win, but if you must lose, lose like a gentleman and a good sportsman. I want you to notice here how Commander Shea not only equates being Catholic with being a good American, but also with being in general a good and honorable man, a gentleman. This is what you are also called to be. This is how you present God to the world. Not by, as I said, standing on top of a bar stool in a bar shouting, "Convert now, ye sinners," but by being a good and honorable man in all that you do. And you do this by presenting God first within yourself, keeping God foremost in your thoughts, and then using that to present God to the world in general. One final one here. Love your grandmother and granddad as long as they live. They too will never let you down. Love your aunts and see them as often as you can. Last of all, don't ever forget your daddy. Pray for him to come back. And if it is God's will that he does not, be the kind of boy and man your daddy wants you to be. I finally want you to note how Commander Shea asked his son to pray for him before God. I ask you to ask your own children, your grandchildren, to continue to ask God to pray on not only your behalf, but also for them to keep God foremost in their thoughts. We must share God with others. Share the knowledge and love of God with others, and not be afraid to do so. A few months after the USS Wasp left port, a Japanese submarine followed a volley of torpedoes at it. It was, in fact, perhaps the most successful torpedo volley of the entire war. Three ships were struck. One was the battleship South Dakota. But the South Dakota was a very tough ship and not only survived, but managed to keep its place in the formation of American ships. Another ship was a small destroyer. Rather amazingly, it survived at least for a few weeks, though it later sank on its way to Pearl Harbor for repairs. But the Wasp was struck by two torpedoes. And the Wasp had never been a very strongly built ship. It caught fire, as you can see here, and it later sank. 194 Americans were killed aboard the Wasp, including Commander Shea. I have, if you wish, copies of the full letter that Commander Shea wrote to his son. I encourage you to read it. and to keep him as an example of how to present God to the world, to your families, to your neighbors, friends, and co-workers. As a man who, yes, encouraged his son and others to be a good Catholic, to be a good Christian, to be a man and a gentleman. And this is how we will present God to the world. And this is how we will heal our civilization, our society. Not by coming up with elaborate plans, but by following the example of men such as John Shea. I understand we're about to have some time for discussion, and so I ask you to think about two things in particular. I ask you to reflect upon this year to date and ask yourself if you have presented God to the world in your life and how you have lived. And secondly, I ask yourself to commit yourselves to concrete actions that will present God to the world through you. Thank you.